hanging incredibly heavy over Eastern Europe. We're witnessing a truly devastating reality. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of lives lost, international laws pretty much pushed aside, and entire cities left in ruins. It's a level of tragedy and military aggression that, honestly, a lot of us thought we'd left behind in the 20th century. But to actually grasp why this is happening today, you can't just scroll through the daily headlines. We have to rewind. We really need to unpack the deep, tangled historical and geopolitical roots that turn two neighboring nations into bitter adversaries.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our agenda, basically our mental roadmap for today. We'll start with the geopolitical heartland, trace centuries of shifting borders, and look at the Soviet-era trauma. From there, we'll cover independence and internal division, hit the 2014 breaking point, and finish up with NATO and the invasion. Step by step, we'll see exactly how today's conflict was built.
But before we even get into the specific history of Russia and Ukraine, we really have to ask ourselves a fundamental question. Why here? Why is Eastern Europe the ultimate geopolitical battleground? To understand the massive human cost we're seeing right now, we first need to zoom all the way out and look at the big, macro-level theories of global power.
So Section 1, the geopolitical heartland, or the geopolitical pivot. We're going to look at a theory from 1904 that quite eerily predicted over a century of global conflict. Back in 1904, a British geographer named Halford Mackinder published an essay introducing what he called the heartland theory. He essentially argued that Eastern Europe is the geographic pivot of history. According to him, whoever controls Eastern Europe commands the heartland, which is this massive strategic zone, and whoever commands that heartland ultimately commands the world. Now, sure, geopolitical experts debate whether this is an absolute truth, but looking back at both World Wars and the Cold War, it is wild that an essay from over 100 years ago maps so perfectly onto modern conflicts. You just can't deny that superpowers have treated this exact region as the ultimate strategic prize. That brings us perfectly to Section 2, centuries of shifting borders. Because of that immense geographical importance we just talked about, Ukraine hasn't just been a nation. Historically, it's been a literal tug of war for surrounding empires. Think about the year 1667 and the Dnieper River. In the same Poland and Lithuania. But by 1667, after years of grueling war, the Russian Empire swooped in and took control of everything east of the Dnieper River. That river literally split the region in half. It wasn't until 1793, under Catherine the Great, that the Russian Empire finally absorbed the remaining western half. So the Dnieper River isn't just a body of water. It's a massive historical fault line, dividing east and west Ukraine. Once the Russian Empire had full control, they didn't just want the land itself, they wanted total assimilation. This led to a process known as Russification. These were aggressive historical policies totally designed to erase distinct Ukrainian and Polish identities. The Ukrainian language was heavily restricted, sometimes outright banned. Catholic churches were closed down, and locals were heavily pressured into converting to the Russian Orthodox Church. It was a very deliberate strategy by the empire to consolidate absolute power over their newly acquired territories. Let's step into the 20th century with Section 3, the Soviet-era trauma, because the fall of the Russian Empire during the 1917 revolution definitely didn't end the struggle for control over Ukraine. Actually, in the absolute chaos of the Russian Revolution, Ukraine actually declared itself an independent state in 1918. But this independence was just a brief flash. By 1922, the Bolsheviks' Red Army had violently consolidated control, and Ukraine was officially absorbed into the newly formed USSR as a Soviet Socialist Republic. And decades later, as part of the Soviet Union, Ukraine would suffer another massive blow in 1986 with the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. That event absolutely crippled the region, both economically and politically. But there's another number from the Soviet era that we really need to pause and acknowledge: 7 million. Let the gravity of that just kind of sink in for a second. This represents the estimated number of Ukrainian lives lost during the 1930s. And this wasn't from a war. This was the Holodomor, an absolutely devastating man-made famine that was a direct result of Soviet agricultural policies under Joseph Stalin. Beyond the famine itself, Stalin engaged in what we can really only call demographic engineering. He knew Western Ukraine had deep historical ties to Europe and harbored strong anti-Russian sentiment. So to secure the Soviet border against Western capitalism, Stalin deliberately moved large populations of ethnic Russians straight into eastern Ukraine, specifically east of that Dnieper River we talked about earlier.
These new residents didn't speak Ukrainian, they didn't share the local culture, and this deliberate shift planted the demographic seeds for the extreme cultural and political divisions that are fracturing modern Ukraine today.
Moving right along to Section 4, Independence and Internal Division. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. Ukraine is an independent nation once again, but they inherit a deeply rooted internal crisis.
You end up with a stark contrast that brilliantly illustrates the internal fracture of this newly independent nation. On one hand, you've got Western Ukraine, historically influenced by Poland and Lithuania, highly pro-European, carrying this really strong sense of Ukrainian nationalism. And on the exact opposite side, you have Eastern Ukraine, heavily influenced by Stalin's demographic engineering, featuring a huge population of ethnic Russians, and leaning decidedly pro-Russian. Centuries of shifting borders had literally created a deeply divided present. Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Stephen Pfeiffer, summarized this whole situation perfectly. He said, "The sun of Ukrainian nationalism is not as deep in the East as it is in the West." And this division meant that post-1991 Ukrainian politics acted like a giant pendulum. Governments would swing wildly back and forth. One election brings in a fiercely pro-Western leader, the very next brings in a deeply pro-Russian leader. This instability set the stage for constant unrest, notably sparking the pro-Western Orange Revolution back in 2004.
Which brings us to Section 5, the 2014 breaking point. This is that pivotal year where the internal friction we just looked at explodes into a massive international crisis. It all kicks off with the Euromaidan Revolution. Ukraine's pro-Russian president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, abruptly rejects a highly anticipated integration agreement with the European Union. In response, massive crowds of citizens, literally draped in EU flags, flooded Independence Square in Kyiv, demanding a pivot back to the West. The protests eventually turned violent, and ultimately, the Ukrainian parliament voted to remove Yanukovych from power entirely. Now, for the Kremlin, watching a pro-Russian leader get ousted right on their border, that was an absolute alarm bell.
Viewing this loss of influence in Kiev as a direct threat, Russia reacted, and fast. First, they annexed the Crimean Peninsula. Now, interestingly, the Russian Empire had initially conquered Crimea way back in 1783, but the Soviet Union had actually gifted it to Ukraine in 1954. But in 2014, under Vladimir Putin, Russia moved swiftly to reclaim and annex it. Second, Russia began actively supporting armed separatist uprisings in the eastern Donbas region, which is, no surprise, the exact area Stalin had populated with ethnic Russians decades prior.
To really solidify this fracture, these eastern regions held referendums. The results claimed that 89% of Donetsk and 96% of Luhansk voted for independence from Ukraine. Now, it is crucial to note here that these referendums were globally unrecognized and heavily criticized. However, from a purely analytical standpoint, they perfectly demonstrate how those demographic seeds planted during the Soviet era had matured and were now literally splitting the country apart. Finally, we reach Section 6, NATO and the invasion. This is where the whole thing evolves from a localized internal Ukrainian struggle to a high-stakes global standoff between Russia and the West. Let's look at the core security dilemma objectively for a second. After the loss of Crimea in 2014, Ukraine was terrified. Understandably so. Their primary goal became joining NATO, specifically to gain the protection of Article 5, which basically states an attack on one member is an attack on all. Russia's view, though, is the exact opposite. Moscow views NATO's continued eastward expansion as an existential military threat right on its doorstep, arguing it violates verbal promises made to Soviet leadership back in 1991. So you have a situation where both sides feel entirely backed into a corner. So how does this political standoff escalate into the horrific conflict we see today? Well, by late 2021, Russia began massing hundreds of thousands of troops right on Ukraine's borders. On February 21, 2022, President Putin officially recognized the breakaway regions of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. Just 3 days later, on February 24th, Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, under the stated goal of demilitarization and denazification. Decades of boiling tension had finally shattered European peace. And that brings us right back to where we started today. The modern toll is catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians are dead. Entire cities are lost. This is a stark, really grim reality. In the face of raw military power, international agreements like the Budapest Memorandum and the Geneva Convention have largely failed to protect a weaker nation. We've unpacked centuries of geopolitics, shifting borders, and demographic engineering in this explainer. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought that goes way beyond the history books and the maps. In an era of incredible modern development and unprecedented global connection, should world leaders have the right to sacrifice millions of lives over geopolitical and ideological differences? It's a heavy question for sure, but one we all must reflect on as we watch history unfold in real time. Thank you so much for joining me to